The longer I live, the more I understand how significant is truth, especially truth before your own self. This is what I'm learning to do. I try to tell truth to myself, because the more truth I understand about myself, the more real reality I see around me. I used to see reality as some sort of fantasy I tried to create. I tried to bend reality to my like, and I tried to rearrange reality into some fantasy I thought it's out there, but it's not there because eventually I paid for those mistakes I made so arrogantly while having no understanding how reality works. And it's happened to me a lot, and I noticed one thing, that I have to understand my real self, and also I have to take responsibility for the truth I understand day by day. Because if I understand truth, I don't tell about it. If I always play safe, I think it's the worst kind of person to be, because I think the most will be punished those who sit on the fence. I think it's Jesus said, not who evil and not who good, but the ones who sit on the fence in the middle. And I think the ones who sit on the fence, it's kind of the ones who worship generic truth. That's why I hate generic truth. Because generic truth, in my opinion, is something that dominates for 1-2 days. That's safe to say, because in some sense you're saying this truth that's incredibly generic because you don't attach yourself to that truth. If I recognize something about something, I have to understand this recognition through my own personal experience. I have to adjust this recognition to myself to make it personal, and only then I will have the ability to express it in a truthful way. But if I just learn something and decided not to adjust to myself, decided not to digest with my own understanding of this truth, then this truth becomes generic, becomes useless, and I'm the one who sits on the fence saying this truth because it's not going to affect me, since many other people say the same stuff. But once you try to understand this truth more deeply and try to integrate your own personality into that truth to make it more personal, then it makes different sense. I remember I used to work with a guy who constantly was saying, when somebody asked him, "Are you married?" he always was saying, "I'm happily taken." And I always thought something is wrong with this saying, why he said what he said, "I'm happily taken." And it took me a while to understand that. It seems like he tried to inflate his importance. He tried to signal that his wife a lucky woman of having him, that he's happily taken. It's so strange because it's kind of delusional. I don't know why, but that's how I felt very delusional. That's what I'm afraid, because I want to see myself without my own personal delusion. It's really hard to see yourself the way you really are. But once you learn to see yourself the way you really are, it's actually liberating. It actually gives you much more freedom, and you're afraid less of other people's opinion about yourself, because you see yourself the way you are, and therefore their opinions, if it goes against how you see yourself, is mostly incorrect because they just don't know who you really are. The whole idea is to understand who I am, is to understand my goal and my dreams. And I noticed one thing about myself, that, for example, if I would never immigrate to America, right, and stay back in Russia, I would always had an excuse not to achieve something significant in my life. I would always say it's because I'm in Russia, but if I would live in America, it would be much different. I would become much more significant person become famous and very successful, but since I live in Russia, have this excuse. The problem is, when I moved to America, I don't have this excuse anymore. And now I have only two choices. Or something wrong with this country, or something wrong with me. And I select something wrong with me because it's the best way, since I can correct myself. I can work on myself, I can understand myself much better and take responsibility for understanding of myself. But I can never correct the country. Because country is just millions of people. You can't just blame the entire country. And that's what a lot of people do. And I always learn one thing. When I look myself in the mirror, I try to blame this person in the mirror constantly. It helps me to change. It helps me to have such a control over my destiny. Because I don't want to have my fate in the hands of an accident. I want to build my life. And that's how I try to perceive myself. And if something doesn't go my way, I try to understand why it doesn't go my way and what else I can do. And I start developing this mentality that if I do something right, even if it's not successful with other people, but if I learn from that, that means it's incredibly successful for me, because in the end, it's not money what matters or fame. What matters is my understanding of myself in the world. And if my understanding of myself and the world makes me mentally and physically stronger, it means there's some grain of truth in this understanding. I'm an individual, and I believe country built out of individuals, and we all have to take responsibility for ourselves. You can only change the country, community for better if you can change yourself. That's what I learned from Jordan Peterson. When he said the simple quote, "Clean your own room," it struck me with simplicity and yes, because this is my place, this is my apartment, this is my room. If it's dirty, do I have a right to go outside and try to change the world? I don't think I do, because I'm responsible for my environment I live. Every day I wake up, I make a bed, because making a bed gives me the beginning of order in my life. And that's very important to understand. I never understood how come people have, for example, a lot of trash in their cars. My car is always clean on the inside because I never eat in my car. I never throw trash in my car because my car is an extension of my apartment. And it must be clean, it must be in order because it represents, in some sense, my psyche. Once you learn this, you mentally become stronger. And that's what I feel. And the money itself, it's good to have money, it's good to have fame, yes. But the most important thing to have is yourself. And to be able to have yourself, you have to understand who you are. And I was thinking about sometimes I'm a little bit concerned to express myself more clearly because I have such a fear that people would think I'm crazy. But then I realize crazy people don't think they're crazy. Crazy people actually pretty certain that they're sane while saying crazy things. Because I work a lot with artificial intelligence and I'm incredibly fascinated with artificial intelligence. And sometimes I have these interesting thoughts to explore, but then when I try to talk about it, I feel like maybe I have AI psychosis. I have to be very careful. But then again, crazy people, incredibly certain about their sanity. And sane people usually question their sanity. It's like if you're intelligent, you would question your knowledge. And if you're ignorant, usually you believe that you know everything. Because the wisest man said, "I know that I know nothing." And this understanding that I know nothing makes in me desire to learn something more. And then again, there's nothing more important than to understand yourself, because we have a lot of news in the world. and we have access to pretty much everything. And now we have this responsibility to be able to properly digest the information we constantly receive unchecked through our devices. Before it was just the news. I remember when I was a kid back in Russia, it was several channels. It was just the news that was filtered for us. Now I have iPhone and I have access to the news that's not filtered at all. And I have to be intelligent enough to understand what should I trust and what should I double check. Because it's actually affect my mental state and my understanding of the world. But again, to be able to filter all those news, I have to understand myself. I have to understand what exactly is my stand. Because if I don't have a stand, if I don't have position, how exactly I supposed to understand the news that I constantly receive through my iPhone? I can't, because I have to always change my stand, always change my position to adjust to the news that come every day. And then eventually it can drive me crazy. Because the whole idea to preserve yourself in this world is to be able to understand who you are and what is your position. Of course, you can improve your position, you can change your position, but only through a rigorous argument. You have to understand, okay, this argument sounds sane. Let me think about it, and we'll see how I can, for example, adjust my position to this argument, because this argument much better than mine, and therefore, to improve my argument, I have to adjust my argument to this argument. We have to evolve, we have to change, and I change myself. I keep changing every day because I keep discovering new books to read, and new people to listen to, and through them I understand again myself. And I understood myself a lot through artificial intelligence. One big problem about artificial intelligence is it doesn't have emotions. But it's incredibly good for intellectual stimulation. But the problem is it drains you in some sense. Another thing, I try to understand myself through writing fictions. And the more I write fictions, the more truth I place inside on those pages. And truth about myself, about my understanding of the world, and about everything. Because in some sense, fiction is not just something that never happened. Fiction is what happening to me emotionally all the time. All those desires, all those fears, all those tragedies that I thought would happen but never did, they in some sense happen on the pages of my fiction. That's why I like writing, because writing in some sense my therapy, in some sense my confession. But through the characters. Like I confess myself through the characters I created. But all of them in some sense the biggest part of me, and some of them more, some of them less. It depends on the topic, depends why I wrote this book in the first place. But then again, I always come to this idea that I have to know myself and I have to discover truth about myself, and only then I should understand the world. For real. You know, it's funny, today I learned that, for example, water. If you take water, it can be liquid, right? But then when it's evaporate, it's turned into air around. You cannot touch it any longer. Maybe the same with our mind. It's inside the body and outside the body as well. Because it's kind of inside my head, but at the same time outside my head. Maybe it's kind of the same connection, water and air, the same body and mind. Maybe it's kind of the same. It's quite fascinating to understand in this case, and try to always compare yourself and understand this knowledge, and compare this knowledge to your own self. Because everything we understand through our own selves. Everything we see through our own selves. And everything we want to have through desires that we inherited from somewhere, knowingly or unknowingly. And the best way to know what you really want, you have to know yourself, because you're going to ask yourself a question: why do I want what I want? That's, I think, the most important thing to understand. Know yourself.